So welcome to today's Tech Hour. It's the 17th of March, and the topic today is more on improving documentation, and it's based upon a workshop I've been going to, organized by Daniele Procida, who's got documentation responsibles for Canonical. And I'm going to begin this session by reviewing some of the things I've learned at the workshop. The workshop's got 4 sessions, but he's doing it online, so we only get 3 of them. We might get the 4th as well, and we're 2/3 of the way through. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Here we go. So now you should have a quadrant in front of you, and also for the benefit of panelists and also to explain things, the first line is tutorial and how to, and the second line is explanation and reference. And up down is practice and theory. The tutorial is a practical thing, and an explanation is a theoretical thing. And left right is study work. So on the left-hand side, so a tutorial is something you study, and a how-to is something you use when you're working. So that's the documentation quadrant that he's introducing into Canonical, and it's not a question of having 4 buckets and you put every piece of documentation in one bucket or the other, though it is important when you're writing the documentation to know which bucket it should go into if it were to go into a bucket. In other words, am I writing a tutorial, in which case your language and mode of expression will change. And similarly for a reference. For a tutorial, you want to omit detail. For a reference, you want to provide detail or indicate where the detail can be found elsewhere in the reference. And the practice theory is somewhat similar also. The tutorial and the how-to you'll probably do when you're at the computer, whereas the explanation and the reference, and certainly the explanation, is probably something you'll do when you're outside the computer. So if you like, one of them is about planning and vision, the bottom line is about planning and vision, and the top line is about doing. If you're driving a car, you don't want a reference manual with you. If you're servicing a car, you probably do want a reference manual with you, or at least available. So that's one of the things we did last week, and a good part of the workshop was actually about getting a practical understanding of these things, not a theoretical understanding, but a practical understanding. Much as it's no good knowing theoretically what north is when you're hiking with a compass. The important thing is to be able to glance at the compass and know what's going on. So the next thing is something I'm introducing, which helps me understand this quadrant, and it's called human modes of activity. So because I'm using video screen sharing, I'll read it out for panelists and anybody else that might be visually impaired. People have different modes of activity. Common modes are sitting, standing, and lying. And listening, talking, and observing are also different modes of activity. Now, software is a tool, and common modes relating to tools, for example, a pen, or a screwdriver, or a typewriter, or anything else, are handling a tool, using a tool, creating a tool, and understanding a tool. And software engineering is perhaps unique in human activity, in the people that write software are extremely well placed to make their own tools. And a lot of software has been developed because people are dissatisfied with the tools they're expected to use. It's not possible for me to make a screwdriver. I can use a screwdriver, I can buy a screwdriver, I can select a screwdriver, but I can't make a screwdriver except by taking a piece of steel and filing it away. And, you know, it needs a separate sort of workshop. You need special tools to make a screwdriver. You need to harden it. So tool making is very important in software. My insight is that software documentation works better when it fits the mode of activity. So whoever's using the software, wants to use the tool, who's consulting the documentation, is in some mode of activity. And quite likely it's one of the 4 modes that I just explained on the previous slide. And to be useful, the knowledge I've just said, that people have modes, must be incorporated into experience and practice. So as we're writing software documentation, we must be aware of the mode of activity of the person reading it. So the next thing is from today's workshop, which is Danielle introduced an analogy with the plant growing from seed. And as the plant is growing, it's always complete, but it's never finished. When I say complete, I mean, you don't say, this is an incomplete sapling, or this is an incomplete seed, or this is an incomplete shoot. It's always right for where it is at the moment. So he has this idea of always complete and never finished. So you document what you've got, and as the thing grows, you add to the documentation. And he likes to think that like a plant is growing from a seed, the docs are made out of cells, small pieces that sit next to each other, are organized in some way, and the cells can divide to produce new cells. So the single README will divide several times before the project gets very far. And one of his ideas is that each cell does its best in its context. In this country, we have a bird called starlings, and they are phenomenally interesting because they fly in these great swarms called murmurations, and they form these fantastic patterns. And it seems as though they do it not through a central design, but by coordinating with their immediate neighbors. Simply by coordinating with their immediate neighbors, they form these massive flocks. And this is for protection against predators, I believe. And that is an indication that complex behavior and complex structures can be created simply by having cells working inside their own context without there being a central guiding principle. So he's against the big plan for documentation. The planning should consist of, we will spend so many hours this week on documentation. I mean, clearly you might have to meet targets and follow progress and that sort of thing, but the idea that, I'll stop there. So he does say that sometimes large changes happen and an embryo folds to become a tube. Embryo of an animal. That's called gastrulation. And somebody said that's your first big journey in life. Before birth comes gastrulation, and that's the first big journey. Because after gastrulation, you have the possibility of eating food and excreting waste. So Danielle says that writing docs is often like tidying the room. Perhaps after the untidy child has been developing things there. Often you have to write docs after development has taken place. That's where the untidiness comes from. is the process of software development. And it says that when you tidy a room, you start somewhere, pick something up, consider it, decide what to do with it, and do it. Sometimes when I tidy the room, I pick something up, I consider it, I decide to put it back down where I got it from, and that's done it. Clearly, you can't do that all the time. But the idea is that you go through this process and the docs are improved, and you repeat the process until you're done or you're out of time. So I'll stop at that point and allow you to ask questions or make comments. I'll be pleased to have those. Nelson, you're about to say something?
I'm still thinking about it, so I'll delay for a moment.
Is that a good sign that you're thinking about it?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Okay.
If you were sure, you wouldn't have to think about it.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to a piece of documentation that, in some sense, in my view, embodies very much always complete and never finished. And it's also highly related to cells. So we move on to the next tab, which is an article I discovered. Carl Linnaeus's botanical paper slips from 1767 to 1773. And one of the important things to know about this time is that paper has become widely available. Because of printing, paper became cheaper and widely available. It might still have been something of a luxury item, and certainly being able to read and write was a luxury skill. But before print, there wasn't much paper. And Linnaeus documented the creation of life, the flora and the fauna, and the fungi too. And he sort of classified things. So it was an enormous piece of work. And I'll just quickly read the first paragraph. The development of paper-based information technologies. Gosh, that's a modern point of view. Linnaeus never thought he was doing that. The development of paper-based information technologies in the early modern period is a field of inquiry that has lately benefited from extensive studies by intellectual historians and historians of science. How scholars cope with ever-increasing amounts of empirical knowledge presented in print and manuscript, leading to the so-called early modern information overload. Oh, do we have any of that today? Yes, we do. It's now being increasingly analysed and understood. And in this paper, they turn to the close of the early modern period and things that Carl Linnaeus did for his plant classification. He used little paper slips of a standard size, pages of memory, to process information on plants and animals that reached him on a daily basis. So if something comes in, he'll make some notes on it. And this reminds me of Nelson's work on BibTeX entries. That articles come in and he writes BibTeX entries for them. And the introduction then says, from today's perspective, these paper slips look surprisingly like modern index cards. And just in case we don't know what they look like, here's one. Oh, my camera's gone off.
Well, you're showing the screen. So
okay. All right then. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes my camera stays on. So the article then continues on through what's going on and gives the history of everything. And I'll put the URL in the chat, if I can. Okay, so let's put it in the chat. And I haven't read that article fully because I only discovered it today. And I think it's really interesting. The whole process of scholarly work developed tremendously during the age of print. I remember reading that Aldus Manutius created, in some sense, the first critical edition of anything. A critical edition is one that provides a standard reference. And he assembled several copies of Dante's Inferno and had scholars go through them and produce the definitive version, trying to reduce all the copyist errors in it. And I'm also reminded of the Concise English Dictionary, which was again attempting to provide a record of all the words, and the slogan of always complete, never finished. You're always trying to have a complete Oxford Dictionary, but there are always new words to come in. And nowadays they make a big fuss about the word of the year, which is the new word that enters the dictionary. So there's lots of stuff going on there. And I'm interested in what Linnaeus was an example of. And there's something called Zettelkasten, which I hadn't heard of until last year. And it's German for slip box, plural Zettelkasten. And it's essentially what Linnaeus had. And if I scroll on, here's a picture of a physical Zettelkasten. And what it consists of is about 6 or 8 shelves. Each shelf has got in it something that looks like a shoebox. One of them has got the name Gabor, which might be the name of a brand of shoes. And there's also boxes of slips of paper on the floor and everywhere. And it's not exactly higgledy-piggledy because there are dividers and everything. So it's a big collection of index cards, approximately. And so that's what a physical Zettelkasten is. And I'll read out. A Zettelkasten consists of many individual notes with ideas and other short pieces of information that are taken down as they occur or are acquired. I'm going to give Nelson an opportunity to say something here.
Yes, this is very much like a scientist reading journals and noting the articles he or she wants to come back to and creating a note about them. And your example of BibTeX entries is an excellent one because it's a compact description of, say, 5 to 15 lines that lets you find that article and get back to it. And so I spend a fair amount of time doing this because I found it's the only way to cover the breadth of literature that I'm interested in and still be able to find things later. That's always the challenging part.
Yeah, it's one thing to make all these notes. It's another thing to find them.
Right, and realistically, unless they're in a computer retrieval system of some sort, they become unmanageable. I mean, the picture you showed there of someone's office with boxes of slips, that's really only accessible to the person who created it. And even then it might take tens of minutes to hours to find a particular thing.
Yes, either arises very quickly or you have to come back to it the next day.
Right.
I have to say that the other day I couldn't find my favorite spoon for eating my breakfast. And after breakfast, I'd found that I put a tray on top of it, and that's why I couldn't find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Donald Knuth, in writing his books on the art of computer programming, made a point of collecting copies of articles that were relevant to the particular volume of the book series and keeping those together in a filing cabinet so we could get back to them easily. I suspect now that we've gone, at least for new literature, into electronic form, he probably just keeps a list of URLs or DOIs to get to them.
The physicality of paper, I think, has its advantages. One of which is you only have one copy of something. You don't have multiple copies scattered across your filing system of the same item.
Yes, and of course you can also add personal notes on your photocopy.
Being able to write on paper is tremendous. And even with computers today, I don't think there's anything bettered. I wonder if Philip or Paulius had anything to say. I'd be particularly interested in Paulius if he can add something to the visually impaired experience of note-taking.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can,
Yes.
It's very nice.
Okay, I maybe will just comment a little bit about general from documentation side. First of all, I didn't hear anything previously about that workshop you just mentioned today. I became a little bit interested, so maybe we'll explore it furthermore later on. Now about when it comes to documentation, I think especially for software, it's important that documentation should be written clearly and completely. When, for example, it comes to when, let's say, new members join maybe the organization and they need to adapt to it. So it's very convenient to have clearly structured documentation, reading and understanding how things works. And especially, I quite recently discovered the quite popular documentation service around the software around the world. It's Write the Docs and Read the Docs. A very helpful tool for organizing and managing documentations. Maybe that's all for now.
That's very good. I wonder if Philip would like to join in or hold his peace.
Yeah, 2 points. First, inspired by a book which I mentioned in the chat. I once started such a Zettelkasten myself, but I never actually used it that much. I tend to have lists and then modify them, cross things out, reorder them, whatever. But another point is, are you gathering information like a huge BibTeX database or something like that? Or do you have a concrete goal in which the ultimate, when you're finished with the project, you've done something with all of the slips, if you like. You sort of, you know, it's sort of like some sort of software scheduling system where you have some which need to be worked on, and then some which working on the background. And when you're finished, the box is empty, if you like. And in connection with that, I don't know if anyone here has heard of something called the Kanban, which is a Japanese system, which originally was used with physical slips on a bulletin board shared by many people. And the idea was you would move these about depending on what their status was within the project. But now there are, I don't know, dozens, probably hundreds of software Kanbans with various features and so on, which is sort of an advanced electronic Zettelkasten, and the idea is to use it to track the status of a project. And yeah, it's certainly something worth looking into.
Yeah, I'd like to just also make a comment about the Zettelkasten. James Murray's work in the 1800s of developing the multi-volume Oxford English Dictionary was a really outstanding example of this, because he had a substantial staff and also would place advertisements in popular newspapers in Britain and possibly elsewhere, asking for people to find the earliest instances of particular words that he was working on for the dictionary. And it was a marvelous organizational job. And it essentially took him the rest of his life. And yet he only got up, I think, to letter K or L in the alphabet when he died. But the work carried on for decades and is still carried on. And today, the corpus of the Oxford English Dictionary is very heavily marked up in SGML. If you do have access to the online form at oee.com, which does require subscription, and you examine individual entries, you'll discover there's a tremendous amount of typographical detail recorded there, along with historical uses of words. So it's probably one of the greatest organizational jobs of human information that's been done, along with encyclopedias.
Philip has put a YouTube video, a link to a YouTube video on the Complete Oxford Dictionary. Could you just say a few words about what's in the video, Philip?
Well, you should watch it.
Does it give a historical view of the production? Okay. I had the privilege of, the pleasure of visiting the museum they have at Oxford University Press, which was, you have to do it by appointment. And chap came out and showed our party of three round everything. And the Complete Oxford Dictionary was one of the highlights of the video. The physicality of folding paper, machines for folding paper and sewing signatures and so forth, that was also fascinating. I think I should get back to the Zettelkasten. As Nelson rightly pointed out, you can do it digitally, and that's got advantages. So a Zettelkasten may be created or used in a digital format, sometimes using personal knowledge management software. But it can be, and has long been done on paper, uses index cards. And the article in Wikipedia gives the history. Index cards are due to Thomas Harrison in the 1640s. So all of this is information standards, actually, isn't it? The first words used to be spelt how they were spelt by people. And, you know, the idea that you consult the dictionary to find out how a word should be spelt doesn't make any sense when there wasn't a dictionary. And the first dictionary worth the name was apparently due to Samuel Johnson, who I think was 18th century. And the Wikipedia article then goes on to the work of Carl Linnaeus, and there are other people coming through in this. Philosopher and intellectual historian Hans Bloomberg compiled more than 30,000 cards into his Zettelkasten, which now occupy 32 conservation boxes. So that's about 1,000 cards in a conservation box. And he was inspired by George Christian Lichtenberg, who used special books for researching, keeping information. So there's a lot of background for this. And I'm surprised that I had no knowledge of it at all until last year, because it's such an important feature of information management, if you like. So I'll now move on to this thing here, which I'm afraid it's got images in it. So there's a piece of software called Zettler, a markdown editor for the 21st century. I'll put a link into the chat. And I've installed it and played with it a bit, and it seems pretty slick, although I have to say it's probably completely inaccessible. And it's an editor for editing multiple documents, but the documents are linked. So as tech users, we're used to writing one big document and maybe we'll split the document into chapters. But here, your document can be 300 words. You could have a slip, a zettel, for a paragraph, or for a theorem, or for an equation. And it seems quite a sophisticated piece of software. It's an authoring tool, and at the same time, it's a browsing tool. So it has navigation. And as you may have seen in other pieces of software, the tutorial is obtained by loading the document, by loading one of the documents and following the instructions in it. And I was particularly impressed by the introduction to Zetteler. When you download Zetteler, it gives you something to download, and then a window pops up saying, you should listen to this video or watch this video. And I think it's been very well done. And apologies if you can't see it, you can only hear it. Let's see how it goes.
Hello there, and welcome to this short video introductory series on the Zetteler Markdown Editor. My name is Hendrik. I'm the
Can you hear that? Does it come through?
Yes.
creator and maintainer of the project. And using these videos, I will show you the basic functionality of the application. However, I will not cover each feature exhaustively. So in order to learn everything you need to know about a feature, make sure to always read the documentation. This is also recommended because these videos may not represent the current state of the application at the time you're watching this video. That being said, let's get started. In case you haven't done so already, download the application from our website. Zetteler is a cross-platform application, so it is available for most operating systems out there. So for instance, you can download it for macOS, for Windows, Debian and Fedora, and every other Linux distribution that supports either Debian packages, Fedora packages, or app images. You also have some further options. For instance, on macOS, you can install the application using Homebrew. Once it's installed, you can start the application by clicking on its icon. And on the first start, what you will see is that the application will load some interactive tutorial. This interactive tutorial is meant to give you a first basic overview over many of the features of the application. So we recommend you read through this and follow its instructions in order to learn how to write Markdown, how to create a Zettelkasten, and how to cite using Zetteler. In this video, however, I want to focus more broadly on the user interface in general and explain the 4 major key areas of the application, because a general understanding of them will help you get started with the application and maximize your efficiency using the app.
I'm going to stop there. I was really impressed by this video. We've had 1 minute and 50 seconds. And even if you've never seen the software before, I think you've sort of learned something, and it seems pretty good. And listening to it a second time, I realized that he's sort of using the print documentation or the web page documentation on the web page as, roughly speaking, the script to follow. So they'll say you can install it using Homebrew, which the homepage says, but it doesn't give the command line to do it because there's no point doing that on a video. And I think that sounds quite attractive. And it sounds to me as though if the application is accessible, the video tutorial audio only is actually useful. That the material being shown on the video part is supplementary rather than central. Whereas a lot of video tutorials, the video material is absolutely essential. Do you want to say something, Nelson?
No, not at this point.
Okay. So I think I'm going to stop screen sharing. And then you look, my video will come on. There we go. And think about where we've got to and where we can go next. So I think I see two directions, just in terms of discussion. The one is, what does this mean in terms of TeX authoring? Suppose I want to write my...
Excuse me, I'm getting crosstalk from another video, audio feed.
I don't have anything. I'm going to turn. Is the audio okay now, Nelson? No, you're muted, Nelson.
Sorry, I hear a background that sounds like Monty Python. Maybe it's only at my site.
Philip?
Let me try to investigate here. Oh. No,
I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh. Now I've lost the connection. Let me try to rejoin.
No, you're already here.
You're here. We hear you. You're fine.
Just that it's gone off my screen, so I can't see anything.
Okay.
You can leave and rejoin if you want to. And I'll cut it out of the audio. I'll cut it out of the video. If there are 1,000 of us.
Okay, now I've got it back.
Okay. So we can return to action. So I sort of see at least two ways we can go forward with discussion. The one is, Zettel is an interesting framework for authoring. It's writing in small pieces, encourages writing in small pieces, which is what Daniele was focusing on when he says that when you're writing documentation, each cell should do the best it can in its context. So the idea that you can, it also relates to what a sort of folding editor where you only look at the particular thing you're focused on. So it's a real focusing device. And the first versions of Smalltalk had a sort of browser for the source code, and it showed you everything a function at a time. And for what it's worth, Don Knuth's literate programming breaks the whole program into what might be called paragraphs. They're numbered, they've got a beginning and an end, and then each of them has got a structure. So you could see that in some settings, it's better to view the source code of a literate program, paragraph by paragraph, and consider each paragraph, so to speak, to be a separate file. So that's the first side of it. The second side is going right back to what mode is the person in when they're consulting the documentation. Now, for most software that is, so to speak, not end user software, but close to developer software, the person is writing code. The documentation is all about writing code. For TeX, it's a bit different. For TeX, what you're doing is you're writing a document, and from time to time, you need information, not about the document you're writing, but about the system that you're using. So it's rather as though you're driving a car and you want some navigational information. Now, the traditional way of getting that navigational information, certainly in the motorsport called rallying, is have a navigator with you who gives you, who is taking care of the maps and is providing you with an audio interface saying this is what's coming up. There's going to be some a left turn and the road coming in from the right. It's that sort of information. Or in 5 minutes, we're going to have to leave the highway, leave the freeway. That's the sort of thing a navigator does. And the sat-nav now performs that human role. So what should documentation look like to the person who is writing a tech document? Now, I'm thinking back to when I first bought my copy of the tech book, and it cost something like $15 or $20. And that might sound like a lot of money, but a computer would cost about $2,000. That's 100 times the price of a book. Nowadays, a book costs about £5 to £10. Let's say it costs £20. Well, a mobile phone that's fairly good, and it does things like take photos and do all sorts of other things, costs about £100, £150. So the ratio is 7 to 1 in terms of the cost of a book and the cost of a computer. Whereas previously it was something like 100 to 1. And not only that, but the computer you get is so much more marvelous, and it will fit in your pocket. And if you can fit it in your pocket, it means you've got it with you 12 hours a day. Whereas if it's sitting at your desktop, you've only got it with you about 4 hours a day or 6 hours a day. So the whole
top for 12 hours a day.
What? Yeah, I'm averaging up quite a bit. So the balance between the study and the use of and the work is quite different. So it sort of made sense to print things out. I mean, the idea that you would come to the computer not knowing what it was you wanted to do. Well, previously it was you made your punch cards and you brought them in and waited for them to be processed. And then you had to sort of queue up a bit to get a terminal. And then operating systems such as Multics and Unix introduced, and there was time sharing, but still there was a limited number of terminals, and terminals were expensive. So there's this whole difference of balance, which is determining the culture that took place when Don Knuth was writing the tech book. And nowadays, it's really easy to, well, you have these integrated development environments which can actually include the document, sort of bring the documentation up as you type the command almost. So that's the other area to think of. So one is, how does it affect authoring for us? And the other is, how does it affect the help we provide to the tech users? And if somebody is happily writing stuff in Zettel and got a flow going and they get stuck on how an align works, they don't want to break that flow too much by having to consult a piece of paper or search the web or something. They like to sort of get that information up fairly quickly. And I think they'd be best served if they could link to that information within the documents. I know that when I copy something from Stack Overflow, I put a link to it in my script or whatever it is I'm writing. So I'll stop there, and I hope that we're close to 7:30, which is the official closing point, but I hope that some of us will stay on later because we find it also interesting and important. Nelson.
Yeah, I was going to add a comment. There wasn't any discussion at the beginning of the timeline for documentation. And I think for a lot of projects that are done by small groups, the documentation is written largely after the project is completed or is largely operational. If you go to the military or government environment, often there's a procurements document and a design specification that may have taken months or years to produce. And then that's farmed out to a company to actually implement the specification. And of course, that doesn't work well for small groups either. I can just give an example here of a project I'm currently working on. It's a book of currently 170 pages. It'll be about 250 when it's done. And it's called The Design of a Library. And it's a book that's a polished book. It has material in color, it has mathematics, it has computer output, and it has an extensive colored index as well. And I found it useful in writing this document and the library to write the library code simultaneously with the documentation. And usually I'm writing the documentation first as to what this piece of the library is supposed to do. And then based on that description and thinking a lot about it, I write the software that matches it. And this has now become a library of about 350 functions. So that's a lot of stuff to document. And I have not yet written manual pages for it. And this is somewhat of a big problem because manual pages are somewhat boilerplate. And yet the prose that describes each function is unique to each manual page, even if the general layout of the headings and so on is common. And so I don't yet know what I'm going to do about this. If you look at other large libraries, for example, Unicode library, which is 1.5 million lines of source code. I just installed the latest version here yesterday. There really aren't manual pages for each of the functions in that library. And that's, I think, a great loss. What you instead get are pointers to online documents on the web in PDF form. I was also working on the installation of one of the major SQL servers. And when I ran the man command on it, it essentially had 2 pages of prose and a pointer to online documentation. So in order to find out what options were available, I actually had to consult the web. Or it also told me I could say program name -- help. And that gave a very brief output that says if you want more, add -- verbose. And then it produces a fair amount of information. But I think we really don't yet have a good solid way of documenting complex pieces of software. In the early days of Unix, each of the tools was relatively simple, would often be a few tens of lines to perhaps 1,000 or 2 at most, because it had to run on a small address computer. And it was feasible to write documentation in a page or 2 that described everything that program did. But today, with pieces of software as complex as the CLang and GNU compilers, which are each 5 to 10 million lines of code, and web browsers, which are also multiple million lines of code, it's a much more difficult task. And I don't think we've succeeded terribly well at doing it.
Another point is sort of like in the old days when you would, take a long airplane flight, you had really good food. Because the flying was so expensive, throwing in good food was just a marginal increase in the cost. I think the same thing I have the so-called gray wall, the BMS version 5 documentation. And it's a huge effort, but back when computers cost 100,000, you could throw in really good documentation, increase the price by only 10% and people would buy it. But now the same documentation would be unfeasible for something which costs 100, say, rather than 100,000. So I think that's also a scaling aspect, which means that the old documentation was much better simply because the budget was different.
Right.
I mean, would be the the Cray computers. When you leased one, you got the pilots who were people who came with it. Yeah.
And if you look at a desktop operating system like Microsoft Windows, it doesn't even really have a concept of documentation. Everything's supposed to be self-explanatory, even if it usually isn't. Apple is relatively similar. It does have manual pages for some of its commands, but it's larger pieces of software. You just have to figure things out from guessing at what the menus offer, or occasionally there's some pointers to more documentation. And I think this is relatively unfortunate because even though simple things might be obvious to a beginning user of a piece of software, more complicated things rarely are.
I'm sort of reminded of a piece of wisdom, which is the optimist thinks it's the best of all possible, that this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist knows that it is. And the Apple manufacturers, if you like, they're the optimists. They think that the system shouldn't need any documentation. And they're quite right to ship it without documentation if they were right. But there are so many obscure behaviors, and so I have a sort of mixed feeling of I can use my phone without documentation, though it felt a bit uncomfortable to begin with. But when I'm at the command line, I expect documentation to be available. When I'm writing a script and I can't remember what tar does or what the order of the options is, or I get an error and I can't figure out why I got it wrong. I expect to be able to go man tar and I'm getting the information. It's past. Does anybody want to go? And if not, we'll continue. We'll all continue.
I can probably do another 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay,
I have
we'll
another
do.
meeting to get to.
We'll
Not
do
long
another,
after that.
We'll do another 15 minutes so that we get a good conclusion. I'm going to make some bold statements. The tech community should make more contact with the people who are documenting software, particularly research software. The research software engineers are a movement now, and I think they're international, that wants to raise the status of research software, and the reproducibility of software and the importance of data science is making documentation really important. And we should engage with those people. We should engage with read the docs and write the docs. The Zettelkasten and the Zettel editors such as Zedler, there's another one called Obsidian, which is the name of a stone that is used for a cutting tool that produces a very fine edge. Are people that we would are worth engaging with. I think it's time to say goodbye to PDF-only documentation for TeX macro packages. If the TeX is tradition in a TeX macro package to document the software, and in the documentation of the software to produce an example of the output of the software, which means you've got to do the whole thing in PDF or something. But that's putting the documentation in a place where it's inaccessible to the person who is using it at the time they are using it. I think that the documentation quadrant has work and study as one of the axes. So a how-to is a work item and a reference is a study item. And a tutorial is a sort of work item, and an explanation is a study item. So a book, a physical book, such as you're holding the other few minutes ago, Nelson, is a study item. Mm-hmm. And when computers are expensive, you had to study before you could use the computer. And the idea that you'd use the computer for anything other than computing was a strange one. You should go and study from a book, and when you've studied from the book, then you can write your program, and then the computer will run your program for you. So if we can develop HTML documentation that meets the needs of users, that would be a big benefit. And part of that is getting away from the PDF-only approach we've had to TeX documentation. The TeX documentation is only available, you know, the LaTeX macro package is only available as PDF. I think we have to get away from that. And that in practice will be a hard slog to deal with the backlog and to persuade people that they need to do things a bit differently. Kanban boards are quite interesting. I came across them as part of Agile programming, and also part of Agile programming is things like user stories and post-it notes. And in some sense, a post-it note, well, it's a note, isn't it? And a Zettel is a note or a slip. So that's interesting. I'm also fascinated, though I've never had a Mac, about HyperCard. HyperCard was all the rage at one time. I might still have a copy of the HyperCard book, which is a physical book, because I thought it might be interesting. People put a lot of effort into making HyperCard stacks that did things. And I'll just show you something that I've done here by accident today. I'll describe it for Paulius. I'm using Gmail and I'm using the drafting mode to display stuff on the screen. And at the moment it's displaying documentation grows. And underneath it are two tabs I can click, one of which says human modes of activity and the other says the document quadrant. And if I click on human modes of activity, it swaps with the thing that's displayed. And similarly, if I hit the documentation quadrant, it swaps with the things that's displayed. So that's a sort of little quick navigation thing, a bit like alt tabbing for visually sighted people, that allows you to switch from, make a context switch, make a mode switch. So the final thing I'm seeing as of interest here is that people are in some mode. I'm in the mode of talking. I hope you're both in the mode, you three are all in the mode of listening. There's another mode which is called arguing. There's another mode which is called singing. There's another mode which is called, for example, applause or booing. There's all sorts of different modes. And when writing documents for a book, when you're writing a book, you know that the person is in a reading mode. But when you're writing in an electronic age, in a digital age, you actually don't know what mode the person is in. The reading mode is usually a sitting mode, whereas nowadays the person might be on the mobile phone and could be standing in a tube train. I'll stop at that point. I've more than said enough. And Nelson's next.
Yeah, I have a comment here. A number of years ago, probably of the order of 15, my university, which has roughly 30 to 35,000 students and about 10 to 12,000 faculty and staff, so a community of about 40,000 people, invested in a web technology so that instructors could put material onto a website that was accessible only to the students. One reason for doing this is they could then put copyrighted material there that would not be spread over the entire web. And this ran for a few years, and then precipitously one day somebody higher up decided, we're not going to do this anymore, we're going to get this new system. And so they took away the old system and put in the new one, and essentially there was no mechanism whatsoever for flowing information from the old system to the new one. I complained about this bitterly, and I said, you know, why are we spending money on this kind of a system when it can be, the rug can be pulled out from underneath us in the future, and all of the effort we put into developing a course with a nice website with resources on it for the students in the class can become totally useless. And so my feeling was that this was really a bad idea. I did get them to confirm that the software they finally adopted did have as part of its license that if the company went out of business, the software would be permanently owned by the university, which meant there was some chance of keeping it running. Nevertheless, it is a concern that we see an awful lot of technology, especially software technology, being developed, where the designers really have no notion of how important it is to have a long-term availability, so that documents prepared in 1 year can be viewed and processed decades later. And so, yes, HyperCard was an interesting idea. It was based on older ideas that Doug Engelbrecht and Vannevar Bush back in the 1940s had. But it more or less disappeared, and people who spent a lot of effort developing stuff in HyperCard format were basically up the creek. So my feeling is that we would, as instructors at a university, we would be much better off in building small websites for the course. It doesn't give us, of course, control over who can access the websites, but at least it has the possibility that HTML is now so widespread that it really is never going to go away in even our grandchildren's lifetimes. So I think that's a reasonable target to develop for, but it's also a very, very general form and isn't tied to any particular production technology like a piece of software from a big company that may decide to abandon it later. So here I would argue that documentation is certainly important, but let's follow the Unix principle of keep it simple, stupid, because that has the chance of surviving. And most commercial formats do not survive. So I'm done with that comment.
Can I ask an awkward question, Nelson?
Sure.
You don't have to answer it. Would you like to give a presentation on this, about half an hour, and then lead a discussion at some
I
future
suppose
time?
I could. I have to think about it and prepare something a little more formal rather than just sitting here and spouting off what comes to mind. But
So
it's a significant issue in the computing industry that the view of a lot of software is that what you're using the software today is only for today and maybe for next week and next month. But 3 months or 6 months from now, we'll have a new version of the product, which is incompatible with the current one. And you can throw your old stuff away and or rewrite it for the new system. This is
probably the reason why the documentation
history of
is not quite as good.
Yeah, it's a sad history of the computing industry over a great many years.
So this is really about the durability of documents.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the benefits of PDF was the promise backed by the commercial business model of Adobe that PDF is durable.
Yes.
If PDF ceased to be durable, then Adobe's shares would tank.
Mm-hmm. But they keep going up, and we have a large Adobe site about a half an hour's drive south of where I'm sitting. The whole business of Adobe came out of my mathematics department here at Utah.
Okay, that's another story that we could ask you to talk about. I wonder if Philip has got some closing remarks.
I just wanted to ask a question regarding Nelson's statement that the software would belong to the university if the company went bust. How common is that with regard to the software, but also with regard to licenses?
Yeah, I think it's very uncommon.
Uncommon.
The first instance I came across was the company called JSTOR, which was formed in I think about the late 1990s. And the president of the company came to our campus and gave a presentation of what they're doing. This is an organization, not a commercial company, but one that was originally supported by United States National Science Foundation funding to digitize complete archives of important journals. And they started out with 30 or 40 journals, and they're now up to a few thousand. But they did two things that I think were very important. They recognized that the quality of optical character recognition would change over time. So it was important for them to do high resolution, high quality scans from the beginning and use the current OCR technology to offer searchable material, but not normally to expose that to the user. And then as the technology improved, the searching would improve. So that was one important thing. The other thing was they decided that they would always digitize from volume 1, number 1 forward, not from the current issues backwards, which is what most commercial publishers have done, is they've attempted to provide their offerings in digital form. And the third thing, which was really the most important, was that the licensing of JSTOR is such that if JSTOR goes out of business, its current licensees own the entire archive and are free to use it in any way they wish.
Mhm.
So what they've done to address the copyright issues with publishers of journals is to say, look, we will provide the digitization of your back issues so that you can use that and pass that on to your customers. And if you prefer, we will have a moving window, often 1 to 5 years, where we will not cover your current publications, so that readers of the current material have to get it from you and pay fees accordingly. But once it's older than the moving window, then we have this available in JSTOR for all of our licensees. Now, JSTOR isn't accessible to the general public, but a great many universities have signed on to it because it's relatively modestly priced compared to a lot of commercial software. And I'm sure my university spends millions of dollars a year for Microsoft products, and they spend far, far less than that for JSTOR. So that, I think, is a good example of an intellectually honest and open model of how do we provide documentation.
It's not a commercial company though, right?
No, it continues to be, it's jstor.org, which typically means some sort of nonprofit organization that gets its funding from the government or from subscriptions. We also have, for a number of journals, agreements with publishers that provide online access, but often it has a moving window. So for example, for Nature, which is one of the most popular science journals, we have a roughly 5-year window, and that's great if I want to read the latest stuff in Nature. But if I want to look up a Nature article from 1960, it's inaccessible to me. And I think that's highly unfortunate, because one of the things it means is that an article that you had last year and could refer to and read online, next year will not be available to you. And this is highly regrettable, and I really don't like these licensing agreements. But what has happened is big publishers have come to universities with a bundled package saying, we will offer you online access to these 500 journals that we publish. And there's no negotiation ability. The contracts are generally secret and have a condition that the library staff are not allowed to reveal the costs or discuss them with anyone. And it's really, it's sort of like cable television, where you might be interested in getting channels on various subject areas or various languages, but you can't. You have to buy the bundle of 100 or 500 channels, and you have no choice in the matter. And if the ones you want aren't in the bundle, well, you're out of luck. You know, for example, I sit in the United States. I would very much like to watch European broadcasting in German and French and Swedish and Danish, Norwegian, and so on. But I have no access to that because none of my providers supply that. There was one channel that ran locally here on our educational television network, and about 2 or 3 years ago, it went commercial, and so we no longer have it.
I think I'm going to ask Paulius if he's got any comments.
Well, it's actually an interesting topic, but I'm not very a big expert in documentation. Just to add some little things from developer perspective. In my point of view, as it was mentioned earlier, like the documentation should go along with software development to be always more or less up to date. And the thing which I maybe would prioritize if working with documentation projects would be that it should be written in a way that it could be easily readable and easily understandable, even not only for experts of the part of documentation is written for, but for maybe simple users who are not considering themselves as expertise and just they are reading or browsing documentation in order to quickly find something how to do. So in my opinion, the documentation, when writing a good documentation, it should focus not only on things which requires to be documented, but also in such a way that it should be easy to follow along it.
Yeah, I wanted to make one comment about the Unix manual page system. I'm on the developers list of a number of different flavors of operating system development in both the Linux community, the Solaris community, and the various VSD communities. And in all but one of those, there's very little mention of developing manual page documentation, but there's certainly teams that work on it. And the FreeBSD operating system has an excellent online handbook that's kept up to date and has been a model of how documentation can be done. But they never discuss the manual pages very much. But in the OpenBSD community, which is relatively active in its developers list, I get 25 to 50 messages a day from them. Quite often there's a flurry of discussion of particular manual pages where someone has decided something isn't clear enough, or there are new options have been added to the software that aren't documented. And people tend to go over the documentation with a fine-tooth comb, not only to make sure that it's correct, but also to make sure that nothing creeps in that isn't relevant to learning how to use that software. Because sometimes authors want to add information about other things that are related to what the software does, but for the user of the software, that's not relevant. And so others on the list will say, no, please take out those paragraphs because they don't matter when you're trying to use this piece of software. So I think this is a healthy thing to happen. I suspect, when there were big commercial developers of Unix systems like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Sun, and Silicon Graphics, and so on, that they probably had documentation writing teams who worked on this. But now that most operating systems, apart from Mac OS and Windows, are open source projects, it's much less a thing that people concentrate on. And I'm sorry to say that I see way too many software packages that come with nice installers that install binaries and libraries, but no manual pages. And if I were the king of the world, I would simply decree that thou shalt not have permission to install any software unless the documentation is installed. And secondly, that the documentation shall never be separated from the software. Most of these, the Linux and BSD systems divide software packages into operating software needed to use the package, like header files in C, and then a documentation block, which is a separate package. And many people, of course, will leave off the documentation to save disk space. But I fundamentally think that's wrong. So you can see I'm somewhat of a curmudgeon. That's because I have gray hair and I've been around a long time, but I have enough experience with computers that I've many times found that I wanted more documentation of what something was doing and I couldn't find it.
I'm going to close this with something from Maya Angelou. In 1979, she spoke at a press conference in Richmond, Virginia, and she attributed the saying, "Easy reading is damn hard writing." I'll say that again. Easy reading is damn hard writing. And she attributed those words to Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Mm-hmm.
A quick look at Quote Investigator.
Wonderful site.
Wonderful site. Quote Investigator says that that claim is perhaps not fully documented. Oh, I shall let Abraham Lincoln have the last word. The trouble with quotations on the internet is you cannot be sure of their attribution. Abraham Lincoln. See you all next week.
Yes.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks. Goodbye.